Hi and welcome to Photo IQ. I'm your instructor, Gus Cantivero. This is Unit 10 for Camera Basics. We're going to pick up right where we left off in the last unit and talk about the other modes available on your camera. Let's get started. Let's move over to one of the other primary modes that you're going to encounter, and that's your shutter mode. So we talked about the exposure modes and how you may utilize those to combine the different effects of the primary controls to achieve your perfect exposure. But there's other ways that you can interact with your camera and tell it how you want to read the scene. Not just read the unique scene, but behave in the way that makes sense to you as a photographer and the way that you see the scene. So the next thing we're going to talk about is shutter modes. So the shutter can behave in ways that are more refined and controlled, or it can behave in a way that is much more suited to action. So let's say that you're shooting a basketball game. Well, it would be kind of crazy to think that you're only going to take one shot of a player doing a crossover and then a jump shot. I mean, that'd be ridiculous. There's going to be a million little beautiful moments that happen in between there. And if you just take one, well, what if the player's eyes are closed? Or, what if it's kind of like, sort of an awkward position of the knees or something like that? You're going to want to make sure that you get a number of shots in that motion in order for you to choose which is A, the most flattering, but also B, the coolest point of that action. When in some of the other modules where we talk about shooting action, we're going to talk about things that are the point of tension, the moment of tension. It's right before when something critical is about to happen, and the viewer is able to sort of paint a picture and want to know, is that shot going to go in? Is the shot going to get blocked by the opposing player? There's a million possibilities that could happen there, but it is the moment where is the key, the pinnacle of the drama of that action. So you can shoot in single mode, and if you're shooting a still object, like a landscape or a portrait, or perhaps a still life, it won't be necessary to have a burst of 7 or 8 frames of the exact same thing. Nothing is going to change in that time. So it's perfectly fine to just shoot in single mode. Sometimes what I will do is I will use single when I'm shooting portraits because I don't want 10 frames that are so similar to each other, but I want them to be spaced apart just a little bit so that there's a little bit of emotion with the head angle or a smile or hair moving. So what I will do is I will, in rapid succession, shoot 4 or 5 single frames. Now those won't be anywhere close to all within a second or a second and a half. It'll be 5 frames over 2 seconds. And that's enough of a difference for me to have to choose from, and then I'll get rid of the ones that I don't want. Sometimes if you're shooting portraits of a person who blinks a lot, so for example of children, kids are notorious for not staying still and they blink a lot and they make a lot of funny faces, and toddlers will stick out their tongue and randomly stick their fingers in their noses. So you want to be able to shoot that in continuous because you're dealing with very compressed moments that are going to be your moment of opportunity. A toddler may only give you one good shot in a 15-minute shooting session. So you're going to want to make sure that you maximize your potential to get something great out of that. So that's a scenario where you want to choose continuous over single shot. Then of course there's even one above that one. And you're going to see an example of that on the Fuji shutter mode dial that I have here as an example. You can see that it has S for single, CL and CH. Now CL is continuous low speed, which is around 5+ frames per second. Then continuous high, which will jump you up to 8 and above frames per second, and that's based on your preference. You can change it to be what you want. Even in continuous low, you have a variety of options to choose from, where you can choose fewer frames or more frames, and then you can jump up to continuous high and choose how much you want it to be. It actually can go all the way up to 30 frames per second, But there's caveats that come with it. There's limitations. The cameras are not capable of doing literally anything. There has to be some kind of a drawback in order for it to gain speed. To gain speed, it's going to have to reduce the amount of data that it's recording. So for example, you can set it to go to JPEG instead of RAW, and then the amount of data that it's going to have to record is going to be drastically reduced. Now you can shoot a much higher frame rate. Then there's another thing that you can do to increase the speed even more, and that would be electronic shutter. And you'll see that as the next bullet point beneath high-speed burst. Well, as you know from the previous units, we talked about what the shutter is. The shutter is a mechanical device that physically closes and blocks off the light. It's like a little gate. It's going to drop down and lift up from the bottom and close the scene. And when it closes it, it's going to stop recording. So the amount of speed that it does, that is how long your shutter speed is. There is a physical limitation to how fast the physical shutter can move. And if you have an extremely high shutter speed, the physical shutter can move on some cameras up to about 8,000th of a second. However, the camera is capable of recording at even faster than that. But in order to go to that speed, the camera has to set it to be an electronic shutter. The electronic shutter is basically going to tell the sensor how much time it wants it to record. Now there's a drawback to that as well. So it can go beyond 8,000th of a second, so you can actually shoot really fast action. However, if you're recording under fluorescent lighting or a non-photography high-speed refresh LED lighting, those lights are going to flicker. And they're going to flicker at a speed that is nowhere near the speed of 10,000th of a second. So if you're going to shoot in electronic shutter, you may see some weird oddities where portions of the frame are not exposed as equally as other parts of the frame. You may also see something that's called rolling shutter, which is when something is moving very, very fast across the frame, a vertical line may bend, like a light pole. So if you're moving in a car that's moving very fast, or you are, say for example, you're trying to shoot a motorcycle or a race car or something like that that's driving at a very high rate of speed, the vertical lines in the background are going to be blurred like this. They're going to be bent because the camera has a refresh rate where it is scanning from bottom to top. So anything that is at the top of the frame is going to be offset just slightly from the bottom of the frame. So if you have that vertical line, it's going to see the bottom first, followed by the next, followed by the next, followed by the next. As you get to the top, you're going to see that the line has been bent, okay? Each of the different sensors, depending on the resolution and the scan rate, are going to read at a slightly different speed. The Fuji has a very good refresh rate. It actually doesn't do too much of that jello frame. So the rolling shutter is not going to be bad on that one. However, on the Sonys, they have notoriously bad rolling shutter. And that's just because the refresh rate on those sensors is just not as high. However, they excel in other ways. They have decided to make a trade-off where they are trading refresh rate for resolution and sharpness and other benefits. So as always with technology, to gain one thing, you always have to trade off something else. You have to add some kind of ability, you're going to have to trade off something for a lower power use or lower data throughput speed or something like that. But of course, remember, every generation of camera makes improvements, but it is up to the manufacturers to decide how important one is over another. Now, since the vast majority of photography is taken with a mechanical shutter, the physical shutter that opens and closes, that jelly frame, that lag, is not necessarily at the top of the priority. So in order to achieve some of those really high frame per second numbers, the camera is usually going to have to resort to an electronic shutter, which means that it's going to be best suited for daylight, for the sun, because there is no refresh rate or flicker with the sun, or candlelight. There will be with LED and with fluorescent light bulbs. Incandescent bulbs also do not have a flicker. That's just a hot source that emits a light. So you'll be fine shooting in those scenarios. Just keep it in mind. The last option that I have listed here, because it's pretty common to see, however not consistent across the range, is panorama mode. Some cameras will require that you go into the menu and enable this feature. Some cameras are going to have a physical selection for them. On my Sony, I have to actually just switch my mode dial on top over to the panorama function. On my Fuji, I have over here, you can see, actually I don't know why I'm picking this up, it's right here. On the image here beside me, it's hidden, but it's over in there. You have movie, bracket, continuous high, continuous low, single. Then this is actually a fun feature, it's called double exposure. Then you have an advanced filter setting, which would be like toy camera or miniature effect or something like that. And then beyond that one, there's going to be the panorama mode. And panorama modes work by the camera taking a series of images in continuity, and then it uses software to stitch them together. And usually the camera will enter a motor drive function where it just automatically begins taking images, and it will tell you to pan across. Then as you pan slowly and it's taking many photos, it will then use the software to determine the sharpest parts of each image that were taken, align any of the lines, read the situation, and then create for you a long panorama, which is pretty cool. It's a great effect. Typically when it's done in camera, it's going to output a JPEG image though. So it's going to remove your ability to do a lot of those post-processing options. There are better, superior ways to take panoramas by shooting individual images on a tripod and then stitching them together using Photoshop or Lightroom or Capture One or different software that's out there. You can then stitch those images together, create a panorama, and then you maintain a lot of your control using your RAW processing software. If you don't know what RAW is, or if you're just looking for a fun image to share, using the panorama mode on your camera is a perfectly fine way and a fun way to create some panoramas. If I was going to be doing something to create artwork out of it, I would never use the camera's built-in panorama mode. Instead, I would shoot individual raw images on a tripod, moving it just incrementally, and then stitching them together afterward. That would be the proper way to do it. Next, let's look at some metering modes. Every camera, no matter what kind of camera you have, is going to have a meter that's built in. Sometimes on the mirrorless cameras, you will have to cycle through your display functions to see the meter, but the meter will always be there by default. Every DSLR camera, when you look through the viewfinder, beneath your image is going to be your meter. Sometimes it will be vertically on the right or on the left side, but it will always be there. In the center line, that is going to be what the camera believes as optimal exposure. So you can be overexposed or underexposed depending on what the camera is reading the situation. If you're on a bright scene and you have a shadow, your subject might be a person who's in shadow, they're backlit, there's a sun behind them. When you pick up that camera and you look at them, the camera is going to say this is dramatically overexposed. The sky is just a white wash. There's no color, there's no exposure there. It's totally blown out. However, your primary interest is the subject, not the sun. So if you want to take a picture of the subject, you have to tell the camera how to meter the scene. So there are different ways of doing that. You can see the basic ones are spot, center weighted, multi-zone, and average. The spot is going to take a 2% center reading, or sometimes you have a thumb joystick where you can move that spot around the scene. So let's say this kind of situation, you have me, I'm off center. If I were over here, I'd be in the center, but I'm over here. So if you had it on center spot and the camera is looking over here on this wall, or maybe right here on the edge of the white screen, it's gonna say, that's dramatically overexposed. You need to drop your exposure. You're at least a stop and a half overexposed. Well, that's not what you're taking a picture of. So sometimes you have a thumb wheel, a joystick or something where you can tab in a direction pad or something like that. You can tell the camera to move that spot from here over to here. And now you will get a proper reading using that spot from right here on my chest. Sometimes I find that to be a little bit awkward to hold the camera and say, hang on, hold on, while I mess with the camera and I move my spot around. If you only have a few seconds to take a photo, that can be a little awkward. My preference here is to use what's called the auto exposure lock button. Almost all cameras have them. On my Fuji, you can see this is where it's located, and it's right beneath the meter mode dial. So on the camera, on the backside, the meter mode is here. Just beneath it, it says AE-L. AEL stands for auto exposure lock. So what I will do is I will hold my camera and I will compose this image so that the center spot is right on the chest. Then I will hit AE lock, and then I'll recompose the image by moving the frame back to where I want it to off-center the subject, and then take the picture. As long as I have AEL depressed, the camera will not change the meter or the exposure reading. So even if you're on full auto and you have center spot as your metering mode, you can compose the image so that center spot is right on the chest, press the button, recompose, take your image, and then you can let go of the AEL button. The other modes are center weighted, which it puts the most importance at the center of the image, but it will still take an average of the scene by reading what's around that person. And then it will find a balance between the two. Maybe your subject will be a little bit underexposed, and maybe your background will be a little bit overexposed, but at least you'll have some kind of balance between the two. And if you're shooting in RAW, you can always adjust in post-processing to lift the shadows and bring back the highlights, and you'll be somewhere in the middle. The multi, the camera is going to analyze the scene based on segments of the frame. All the cameras are going to have some kind of different distribution of the metering points. And then lastly, you have average, which just takes an average of the entire scene. And that is a very rough way of doing it. It sometimes can go completely wrong. Sometimes it can be great. It just kind of depends. So if you're going to be, say, in the middle of the summer with overhead sun and you're going to be at the zoo, the lighting is going to be pretty much the same everywhere you walk. There's going to be some shadow areas. Sometimes you might go into an attraction like the aquarium portion or something like that. And when you get in there, you may want to change your scene. However, the lighting is going to be pretty dim in there, and it's going to be pretty universal throughout. So average might work out just fine. You're going to want to kind of, when you first get to your situation, play around real quick and see which one is giving you consistent results. You should be okay to stay there. On a camera like my Fuji, which has the metering modes right there on physical display, it makes it very easy for me to switch back and forth to choose which is the appropriate meter. However, I always seem to have pretty good luck when I use my spot metering and then the recompose, the meter and then recompose method that I talked about earlier. That I find to be just the quickest and the most efficient way. I don't really see any need to mess around with the other metering modes. Okay, let's finish up this unit with the focus modes. Now, just like all the other automatic modes that are available on the camera, it is going to use some degree of automatic intelligence to try to analyze the scene combined with your preferences so that it can understand not just what the scene is, but how you like to work. Remember, you need to make the camera work the way that you prefer. Don't just bend yourself to the way the camera operates. If that's the case, you're either using the wrong camera or you're just not setting it up properly. So first, of course, there's manual focus, and you will need to figure out how to enter manual mode because, for example, on certain platforms like Canon and Nikon, there's going to be automatic switches on the lens itself. So you may be trying to figure out how to get into autofocus or get into manual focus mode, and you're hitting the autofocus enable button and it's not doing anything. Well, it could be that your lens is set to manual. So make sure that you check to see if you have a physical switch on there. On mirrorless systems, they don't have switches to enable the autofocus because more or less they are autofocus lenses that will just allow a manual focus override. Even when you're using manual focus on a lot of the mirrorless lenses, all you're doing is turning a digital control ring that is telling the camera to focus further or closer. it's not a mechanical function. Whereas on these lenses, the Canon and the Nikon lenses, it's actually a mechanical lens with an automatic motor built in. So you can enable the automatic motor or disable it. That's the difference. I hope that makes sense. One is always on as a electronic focusing motor, and the other one is a switchable electronic focus motor. So when you get into your single shot or your autofocus single mode, that is going to be the mode where it focuses once and then stops. And it is up to you to tell it to focus again. Now by default, on a lot of the cameras, when you enter autofocus mode, it is going to be a half depression of the shutter button that enables the autofocus. I find that personally to be very annoying because I don't want my shutter button to be married with the autofocus function. I want to be able to tell the camera when I want it to focus, and I don't want that to be connected to whether or not I take the photo. So what I've done on my camera, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here to one of the last points because I feel like it makes sense to inform us for the rest of the points, is the AFL button, which is on all cameras, just like we mentioned the AEL, the auto exposure lock button. The autofocus lock button is going to be on the back side of the camera where your thumb can access it. And what I've done is I set that button up to turn on my autofocus. Normally, its function is to lock your autofocus so that whether or not you press the shutter button again, it will not continue to hunt for focus. What I've done is disable the focus function from the shutter button so that the shutter button only, the only purpose of the shutter button is to take a picture. What I've done is I disable that from the shutter button and I make the AFL the autofocus activate button. So you're gonna have to check your manual or get into your menus to see how to assign that button, but on every camera I've ever owned, I've been able to do that. So I'm under the impression that that is something that pretty much every camera with manual functions should be capable of doing. And I highly recommend that you do that. Set your autofocus enable for your autofocus lock button. So then what you're able to do is put your autofocus point, even if it's a center point, on your subject, press your autofocus lock button, it will focus on the subject, recompose, and then take your picture. The button will continue to do the same thing no matter what mode you're in. So even if you're in continuous mode, which means that the camera is going to continually hunt for focus as your subject moves further and closer to the camera, you can just hold the AFL button down. As long as the button is depressed, it will continue to focus, and you can just take pictures as many times as you want, and it won't disrupt the focus. So when the focus is untethered from the shutter button, you have a lot more flexibility with being able to change and adjust your composition. As I just mentioned, the continuous focus mode is the next one on the list, and that one will continually enable the focus motor so that it will track subjects as they move around the frame. There are different modes and methods for continuous. There's facial tracking, which is probably one of the most beneficial and useful autofocus developments in the last couple generations of cameras, and it's continually getting better. Now we're starting to see animal face tracking, which is extremely useful if you're trying to capture a dog that's running around the yard or something like that, because they move in very unpredictable ways and they're very fast. So the facial tracking continuous mode will do a much better job than any person is able to do with manual focus. Even some of the best seasoned professionals will still have extreme difficulty with keeping dogs or toddlers as they run around, keeping them in focus. They're very unpredictable, basically because they don't behave in the way that an adult would. Toddlers, for example, are so easily distracted and they make decisions that are not necessarily rational. They may lose balance and fall backward, or just decide to fall forward for some reason, or just jump for no reason. They're very excitable, and so similarly, dogs and really small children, they're really tough to photograph. So continuous focus modes are going to be pretty much the only solution to that situation. All lenses will also focus at different speeds and will impact this. So you're going to be affected by the generation of the camera, the quality of the camera, the generation of autofocus technology that's built in, the processor that's built into your camera, and then the type of lens that you're using. If you're using lenses that are of lower quality and lower speed, they are not going to focus as quickly. Most mirrorless lenses are going to have much more rapid and snappy autofocus because of the fact that they are designed first with autofocus in mind, second with optical integrity in mind and build quality. Because the more mechanical lenses are designed to have a motor that is moving physical gears versus just having servo motors where the entire design of the camera lens is designed with autofocus in mind, these are clearly going to focus a lot faster than these Canon mechanical lenses. That's not to say that these aren't fast. They are. They're excellent. They're very good. The mirrorless lenses are just better. You're talking fractions of a second to achieve autofocus with these. So if that is something that you're intending to do, fast-moving sports like, say, lacrosse or basketball, or shooting portraits of toddlers or little children as they grow and develop, mirrorless systems with high developed facial tracking technologies, those are going to be the ones that suit you. Then another feature of autofocus that you're going to want to be aware of, and you're going to need to practice with these. Every system is going to have its own method of doing it, and those are going to be the tracking points, the zones. So there's going to be center, there's going to be a flexible zone or wide zone. Those are going to be built into the sensor. So that's going to depend from camera to camera, not just brand to brand. It's going to be unique to that camera. More expensive cameras are going to have more sophisticated and wider zones of tracking. There's also going to be different ways that the cameras interact with the subject, where if a subject turns away, some cameras will just get confused and say that there's no face in the scene, and then it's just going to jump focus to the background. Other cameras will actually be sort of more patient and wait for a subject to turn around again, or just go from facial tracking to spot tracking, so it'll just pick up my shoulder or the collar or something like that, some kind of high contrast subject in the scene. Then there's different kinds of autofocus technologies. There's phase and there's contrast technology, and both of those are different, and some cameras have hybrids where they use the difference, they combine the two. But once again, this is going to depend and vary depending on the camera that you have, and you're gonna have to experiment a little bit with those methods to see which one is best for what you want. Some cameras will also have autofocus modes that are better for sports, where they will have adjustable tracking and sensitivity speeds. So if you're, for example, shooting a car driving toward you or a sprinter running toward you, the camera is going to have to make sure that it has the fastest possible tracking speed as it adjusts for that changing depth. Sometimes you may not want higher tracking sensitivity or higher tracking speed because there might be a lot of distractions in the scene and you're trying to focus on the one element that's actually not moving. So if you have a lot of passing foreground action, like for example, you're in a crowded public space and there's a lot of people passing between you and the subject, you may want to have it on a lower sensitivity so that it stays on the subject and doesn't get distracted by every possible moving object and distraction. So once again, you need to refer specifically to what your camera is equipped with in order to understand how to use it. I hope that you learned a lot, and I encourage you to refer back to the sections that you need in order to cement some of that information. And even more, I encourage you to get into your camera's menus, look at what you have available, get out there and practice with them. If you set up some repeatable scenarios where you can practice with that mode, you will start to see exactly how they react to the situations that you're in. So I encourage you to get out there and practice. I hope to see you in the next lesson. Until then, keep shooting.